In the spring of 1862, while the American Civil War was burning through Virginia and Tennessee, a man from Salem, Massachusetts was fighting a different war entirely. On the other side of the world, in a country most Americans had never seen, against an army led by a man who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. His name was Frederick Townsend Ward. The war he was fighting had already been going for 11 years. It would kill 30 million people, more than twice the combined military deaths of the First World War, and almost no one back home had any idea he was there. China in 1800 was the most populous nation on earth, and on the surface it looked like it had always looked, ancient, vast, and immovable. The Qing dynasty had ruled for a century and a half. The emperor sat at the center of a civilization that believed itself the axis around which the world turned. There was no reason from the inside to think that would change. But beneath that surface, the foundations were giving way. China's population had more than doubled in the previous century. By 1800, over 300 million people lived within the empire's borders. By 1850, that number had climbed to 430 million. The land had not grown with them. Farmland in southern China had been divided and subdivided across generations until plots were too small to sustain a family. Farmers who had once fed their children were now going hungry themselves. In the river valleys of Guangxi and Guangdong provinces, the pressure was worst. Land that had absorbed migrants for generations was full. There was nowhere left to go. The traditional answer to hard times was the civil service: pass the imperial examinations, earn a post, escape poverty through learning. But the examinations were brutally competitive. Only a tiny fraction of candidates ever passed, and for every man who rose, thousands did not. The countryside filled with educated men who had studied for years and arrived at nothing. The Qing dynasty itself was not Chinese in the way most of its subjects were. The ruling house was Manchu, a people from the northeast who had swept in and toppled the Ming dynasty in 1644. They had ruled China for nearly 2 centuries, but the distinction never fully disappeared. Han Chinese, who made up the vast majority of the population, were required to wear their hair in a long braid at the back of the head, the queue, as a visible mark of submission to Manchu authority. The resentment ran quiet and deep. In the south, ethnic tension ran even closer to the surface. The Hakka were a Han subgroup who had migrated into Guangdong and Guangxi over centuries, and who were never fully accepted by the communities already there. They farmed the poorer land. They lived on the margins. They were taxed the same as everyone else and protected rather less. When famine came, the Hakka felt it first. Then came the opium. For decades, British merchants had been flooding southern China with the drug, grown in India and pushed into Chinese ports in exchange for the silver that flowed back to Britain. By the 1830s, addiction had spread through entire communities: soldiers, officials, laborers. The government tried to stop it. In 1839, the emperor's commissioner seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of British opium on the docks at Canton. Britain went to war over it. The First Opium War lasted 3 years, and it ended in a humiliation that the Qing dynasty would never fully recover from. British gunboats moved up the Yangtze River almost unopposed. The imperial army, which had not fought a serious war in generations, collapsed before weapons it could not match. In 1842, the emperor signed the Treaty of Nanking at gunpoint. The treaty tore open the country. Hong Kong was handed to Britain. 5 ports were open to foreign trade on British terms. British citizens in China were placed beyond Chinese law. They could commit crimes on Chinese soil and face only British courts. The Chinese had to pay Britain's war expenses. The indemnity alone stripped the treasury of funds that might have fed the hungry South. The opium trade continued. It accelerated. By the 1840s, silver was flowing out of China so fast that ordinary peasants found themselves unable to pay their taxes. Taxes assessed in silver, in a countryside where silver was disappearing. Men who had farmed the same land as their fathers and grandfathers now could not meet their obligations to a government that seemed unable to protect them from anything. News of the defeat spread through the countryside in ways the court could not control. The emperor, who governed in the name of heaven, had been driven to his knees by foreign ships. The mandate of heaven, the ancient idea that a dynasty ruled because heaven approved of it, required that the emperor keep order and protect the people. The Qing were visibly failing to do either. Floods came in the late 1840s, then drought. Then the harvest failed. In 1849 and 1850, famine cut through Guangxi province like a blade. Entire villages emptied. Men who had nothing left to lose began looking for someone to follow. The dynasty had no answer for them. Its armies were demoralized. Its treasury was hollowed out. Its legitimacy was eroding with every season. Secret societies had been spreading through the South for years. The triads, the Heaven and Earth Society, anti-Manchu networks that moved through the countryside like underground rivers. They offered belonging, mutual protection, and the old promise that one dynasty's end was another's beginning. China had seen it before. An empire rots from within, and then someone strikes the match. The match, when it came, would be struck by a man that no one in the Qing court had ever heard of. A failed examination candidate from a Hakka farming family in Guangdong, who had read a Christian pamphlet and drawn from it a conclusion that would set the world on fire. Hong Xiuquan was born in 1814 into a Hakka farming family in Guangdong province, in a village close enough to the provincial capital, Guangzhou, that the city felt like a possibility. He was clever. From early childhood, he could recite long passages of the Confucian classics from memory. His village pooled resources to send him to school. Everyone agreed. This was the boy who would pass the examinations and lift his family out of poverty. The entire weight of a community's hope settled on his shoulders before he was old enough to fully understand it. The imperial civil service examinations were the great sorting mechanism of Chinese society. Pass them and you entered the governing class. Security, status, a salary from the emperor's treasury. Fail them and you went back to the farm. The pass rate at the provincial level hovered around 1%. For every man who rose through the system, hundreds of equally capable men were left behind. Hong was among those hundreds. He sat the provincial examinations for the first time in 1827 at 13 years old, traveling to Guangzhou with the weight of his village's expectations. He failed. He went home and studied harder. He returned and failed again. The third attempt came in 1837, and this time the failure broke something in him. He collapsed on the journey home and was bedridden for days, his family unsure whether he would recover. While he lay delirious, he dreamed. The dream was vivid and orderly in a way that dreams rarely are. He was carried to heaven. There, an old man with a golden beard told him that the world was overrun with demons and evil spirits, and that Hong had been chosen to drive them out. A middle-aged man stood nearby and instructed him. Hong was given a sword and a seal of divine authority. Then he was returned to earth. He woke up changed, quieter, more deliberate, carrying something that had not been there before. He recovered and went back to work as a village teacher. He said little about the dream. 6 years passed. In 1843, his cousin Li Jingfang was sorting through a stack of old books on Hong's shelf when he found a pamphlet that had been sitting untouched since 1836. The year a Christian missionary had pressed it into Hong's hands outside an examination hall in Guangzhou. Hong had glanced at it briefly and put it away. Now, after his fourth and final examination failure, his cousin brought it to his attention again. The pamphlet was called Good Words for Exhorting the Age, written by a Chinese Christian preacher named Liang Fa. It was 9 tracts long, a simplified account of Christian teaching, written in plain Chinese for an audience with no knowledge of the Bible. Hong read it this time with complete attention, and as he read, the dream he had carried for 6 years began to reorganize itself around what the pamphlet described. The old man with the golden beard was God the Father. The middle-aged figure who had stood beside him, the one who had called Hong his younger brother, was Jesus Christ. Hong had not been a madman lying in a fever. He had been in heaven. He was the second son of God, sent to China to destroy the demons that had corrupted it. The Manchu dynasty, the false idols, the opium, the suffering of the countryside, all of it was the work of evil that he had been commissioned personally and divinely to destroy. He baptized himself and his cousin in a wooden basin. He went to the village school where he taught and tore down the Confucian tablet from the wall. He told his family what he had understood. Some believed him immediately. Others came to believe him over time. He had always been persuasive and precise, and the conviction with which he described his heavenly commission was not the conviction of a man performing. It was the conviction of a man who had no doubt whatsoever. In 1844, Hong and his close friend Feng Yunshan walked into Guangxi province with almost nothing, no army, no money, no standing, and began to preach. Feng was the more practical of the two, the organizer, the one who could sit with a village elder and explain the new faith in terms the man could act on. Hong was the prophet. Between them, they moved through the mountain communities of Guangxi, speaking to the Hakka poor, who had lost faith in the Qing dynasty and were looking, with increasing desperation, for something to put in its place. The God Worshippers' Society, the movement they founded, spread faster than the authorities noticed. It attracted the people the empire had failed, dispossessed farmers, unemployed miners, charcoal burners, and the members of existing secret societies who recognized in Hong's theology a useful framework for what they already believed. Anti-Manchu feeling, religious fervor, and economic rage fused into a single organization under a single man's divine mandate. In 1847, Hong traveled to Canton to study the Bible more formally under an American Baptist missionary named Issachar Roberts. He stayed for several months, attending Roberts' meetings, learning scripture, adopting the structure of the tent revival into what was becoming a mass movement. Roberts declined to baptize him, uncertain about the unorthodoxy of Hong's beliefs. Hong went back to Guangxi anyway. The refusal changed nothing in him. His theology did not need outside validation. The famine of 1849 and 1850 broke the last remaining patience of the Guangxi countryside. Tens of thousands of people who had endured poverty, flood, and Qing indifference suddenly had nothing left to lose. The God Worshippers' Society was waiting for them. By the summer of 1850, over 20,000 followers had converged on the town of Jintian at Hong's call. Qing troops were sent to disperse them. The troops were routed. On January 11, 1851, the day that would later be taken as the formal start of the Taiping Rebellion, Hong Xiuquan declared the establishment of the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. He took the title of Heavenly King. The man who had failed the imperial examinations 4 times had given himself a title that placed him above every emperor who had ever lived. He was not a subject of heaven. He was heaven's chosen representative on earth. What had begun as one man's breakdown and one borrowed pamphlet was now an army. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for 2 centuries, had no idea yet how serious this was. Within 2 years, it would control more Chinese territory than it had ever imagined possible. Within a decade, 30 million people would be dead. The pamphlet had been sitting on Hong Xiuquan's shelf for 6 years. If his cousin had never picked it up, none of what followed would have happened. That is either the most contingent fact in modern Chinese history, or the clearest sign, as Hong himself believed, that the whole thing was always meant to be. The movement that had begun with a man reading a pamphlet in a moment of despair now had an army. In the summer of 1850, 20,000 God worshippers converged on the town of Jintian in Guangxi at Hong Xiuquan's call. They came carrying what little they owned. They pooled it. Under the Taiping system, individual property was dissolved into communal stores. Food, clothing, money, distributed equally by officers of the new order. For a peasant who had spent years watching his harvest disappear into taxes, the idea was as radical as the theology. The Qing authorities understood that this was dangerous, but not yet how dangerous. In January 1851, they sent troops to disperse what they considered an overgrown religious sect. The troops were routed. In the chaos after the battle, the Qing commander was killed. Hong Xiuquan, standing in the wreckage of a government counterattack that had failed completely, declared his new state. The Taiping Rebellion, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, was born on January 11, 1851, which was also his 37th birthday. He gave himself 5 subordinate kings, each commanding a direction: east, west, north, south, and wing. The most capable of these was Yang Shuqing, the East King, a former charcoal burner from Guangxi, who was illiterate but possessed a mind for logistics and organization that Hong himself lacked. Yang had also developed a troubling habit. He periodically fell into trances during which, he claimed, God the Father spoke through him directly. Hong accepted this. He could hardly refuse. God the Father, speaking through Yang, outranked everyone, including the heavenly king. The army moved north. In the months that followed, it swept through southern China with a momentum that stunned the Qing military. The discipline of the Taiping soldiers was unlike anything the imperial forces had encountered. They did not drink. They did not use opium. They did not harm civilians who submitted. They paid for food rather than taking it. Compared to the plundering of the regular Qing armies, a Taiping regiment moving through a town felt, to many ordinary people, like a relief. By early 1852, the army had grown to hundreds of thousands. Peasants, miners, unemployed men, Hakka communities with grievances against both the Manchu state and local Han landlords, all of them joined. The Taiping were also the first Chinese army in memory to actively recruit women. Female soldiers fought in separate battalions. Some units numbered in the thousands. When Qing officials heard about this, they called it barbaric. The Taiping leadership considered it divine equality. The march north carried them up the Yangtze Valley, through province after province. In September 1852, they attempted to take the great city of Changsha and were held off for nearly 3 months. Their first significant check. Feng Yunshan, the man who had walked into Guangxi with Hong and built the god worshippers from nothing, was killed during the campaign. The South King was dead, and the movement's most practically grounded mind was gone. Hong grieved him and kept moving. In March 1853, the Taiping army reached Nanjing, one of the most historically significant cities in China, the former capital of the Ming dynasty, a city of over 1 million people. The Qing garrison numbered in the tens of thousands. The taking force that arrived outside its walls numbered over 500,000. After 11 days, the city fell. The viceroy of the region was killed in the fighting. Hong Xiuquan entered Nanjing on March 29 to crowds kneeling in the streets. He renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. The former provincial viceroy's palace was converted into the palace of the heavenly king. Hong moved in, surrounded himself with concubines and ministers, and began to govern the most densely populated region of China from behind walls that would eventually become his permanent world. He was 39 years old. He had been in power for 2 years. He would never leave Tianjin again. The laws of the heavenly kingdom were unlike anything China had produced. Opium was banned outright, not regulated, not taxed, destroyed. Tobacco and alcohol, too. Gambling was forbidden. Prostitution was abolished. The Confucian examination system, the very institution whose gates Hong had beaten himself against 4 times, was replaced with a new system of examinations based on the Bible and Taiping scripture. The old order of scholars and officials was dissolved and rebuilt around the new theology. The Confucian family hierarchy was also dismantled. Under the Taiping system, men and women were separated into different communal organizations. Even married couples were housed apart in gender-segregated camps. This was not cruelty. In Hong's theology, the relationship between each person and God was more fundamental than any earthly bond, including marriage. The separation was meant to purify. Many followers accepted it. Others found it the hardest rule to keep. Foot binding, the practice that had deformed the feet of Chinese women for generations, confining them to the domestic world through deliberate physical limitation, was abolished. Taiping women wore trousers. They farmed, they administered, they carried weapons, they could own land equally with men. In the context of 1853 China, this was not a minor reform. There was nothing comparable anywhere in the world at the time. No Western nation had granted women these rights, and the Taiping had arrived at them not through political philosophy, but through scripture. The land system as written was equally radical. All land was to be redistributed according to family size, held in common under the state, with surpluses pooled and deficits covered. In practice, the Taiping rarely had sufficient control over enough territory to implement this fully. War consumed their resources before administration could follow, but the promise of it was enough. In a countryside where tens of millions of people owned nothing, the Taiping land system was the most powerful political offer anyone had made in living memory. Western missionaries arrived in Tianjin expecting to find brothers, Christians governing a Christian state. What they found confused them. Hong had added texts of his own to the Bible, revised passages he disagreed with, and structured a theology in which he himself was a figure of divine authority, second only to God and Jesus. When one missionary pointed out that his reading of certain passages was not correct, Hong revised the passage. The Bible in the heavenly kingdom was subject to the heavenly king's interpretation. The missionaries left disappointed. By mid-1853, the Taiping heavenly kingdom that controlled a continuous territory larger than France, governing tens of millions of people from its capital in Tianjin. It had its own currency, its own calendar, its own simplified written script. It was not a rebellion anymore. It was a state. And the Qing dynasty, sitting in Beijing and watching the Yangtze Valley it had lost, had no clear idea yet how to get it back. What the Qing did not yet see, what no one fully saw, was the fault line running through the heart of the new kingdom. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, had already begun to withdraw. He spent his days in the palace, issuing proclamations, receiving reports. The man who had walked the roads of Guangxi preaching in village squares was retreating behind walls. The army that still believed in him was fighting without him, and Yang Shuqing, the East King, was filling the space Hong left behind with a quiet, gathering ambition. In the spring of 1853, the Qing dynasty held Beijing, and it held its name. It held very little else. The Taiping heavenly kingdom controlled the lower Yangtze Valley, the most economically productive region in China, and its army, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was organized, battle-hardened, and still growing. The wealthiest, most densely populated corridor today had changed hands, and the court in Beijing was trying to understand what had happened to it. The answer, in part, was the Qing army itself. The regular imperial forces, the Green Standard Army and the Manchu Banner troops, had not fought a serious war in a generation. They were underpaid, poorly equipped, and in many units openly corrupt. Officers purchased their commissions. Soldiers supplemented their wages by looting the communities they were supposed to protect. When the Taiping advanced, they met not disciplined resistance, but men who calculated whether surrender was safer than fighting, and frequently decided that it was. In May 1853, Yang Shuqing, the East King, the practical mind behind the Heavenly Kingdom's military strategy, launched two simultaneous campaigns from Tianjin. One force moved west along the Yangtze, pushing toward Wuhan and the Upper River Valley. The other moved north toward Beijing. The plan was to take both directions at once, squeezing the Qing between two fronts while the dynasty was still recovering from the loss of Nanjing. The Western expedition succeeded. Taiping armies swept along the Yangtze, taking city after city, and at their height controlled a continuous belt of territory stretching from Tianjin into the heart of central China. Wuhan fell. Anqing fell. Zhejiang fell. At their peak, the Taiping governed territory larger than France, with tens of millions of people living under the laws of the Heavenly Kingdom. From Beijing, the emperor watched his richest provinces administered by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The Northern Expedition was a different story. In May 1853, two Taiping commanders, Lin Fengshang and Li Kaifang, led a force of between 70 and 80,000 men out of Tianjin and marched north toward Beijing. They moved fast, sweeping through Anhui and Henan, recruiting locals as they went. By the autumn of 1853, they had reached the approaches of Tianjin, the port city that guarded the road to the imperial capital. Panic spread through the Qing court. It seemed possible the dynasty might fall within the year. It did not fall. The Northern Expedition made a fatal error. Instead of pressing directly toward Beijing, while the Qing were disorganized, the commanders paused to besiege the fortified city of Huaiqing. The delay was catastrophic. The Qing used the time to reinforce the capital, bring up cavalry from the northern steppes, and cut the expedition's supply lines. When the cold of the northern winter arrived, the Taiping soldiers, raised in the subtropical south, dressed for a different climate, began to suffer. By the spring of 1855, after nearly 2 years, the Northern Expedition was destroyed. Its commanders were captured and met their end in Qing custody. It was the closest the Taiping ever came to ending the dynasty outright. The failure to take Beijing was the Heavenly Kingdom's defining strategic error, and it came not from a shortage of soldiers, but from a shortage of focus. The Taiping could not govern and conquer simultaneously. As their territory expanded, administration consumed resources that should have supplied the armies. Local officials had to be found, laws had to be enforced, taxes had to be collected, all in the name of a theology that most of the newly conquered population had never heard of 2 years earlier. The Qing, for their part, were learning from the failure of their regular armies. In 1852, while the Taiping were still advancing, a Confucian scholar official named Zheng Guofan had returned to his home province of Hunan to observe the traditional mourning period after his mother's death. The emperor's court, desperate, had ordered him to help organize local defense. Zheng was not a soldier. He was a scholar, a poet, a man steeped in Confucian ethics who had spent his life in government ministries. But he was also methodical, deeply serious, and possessed of a clarity about what had gone wrong. The Xiang army that Zheng built was unlike anything the Qing had deployed before. He recruited from the countryside. Hunanese farmers and gentry who had a stake in the existing order, who understood that the Taiping's destruction of Confucian hierarchy was not abstract theology but a direct threat to their world. He paid them properly. He selected officers not for connections but for competence. He built a river flotilla because he understood that control of the Yangtze was the key to everything. He financed it himself. Through a local tax he collected without imperial approval, because waiting for Beijing would mean waiting too long. Zheng suffered early defeats. In early 1855, after a disastrous engagement at Zhejiang, he reached the lowest point of his life, stopped from the edge of despair by those around him. He went home, reorganized, and returned. He had the quality that would eventually prove decisive, not brilliance but persistence. The Taiping could outfight the Qing regular army. They could not outlast a man who refused to stop. The Taiping, at their height, made one more attempt to broker peace with the West on their own terms. Hong Xiuquan believed that Christian powers would recognize the Heavenly Kingdom as a natural ally, a Christian state fighting a non-Christian dynasty. Representatives were sent to meet with British and American officials in the treaty ports. The meetings were courteous and ended in nothing. The Western powers had commercial treaties with the Qing dynasty. They had warehouses in Shanghai and trade agreements that generated profit. The Heavenly Kingdom offered them theology. The Qing offered them business. What the Taiping could not see from inside the heavenly capital was that the gentry class, The landlords, scholars, and local administrators who formed the backbone of Chinese civil society had already chosen sides and had not chosen them. The Taiping anti-Confucian program had alienated precisely the people needed to govern a country. Every Confucian tablet the Taiping destroyed, every examination hall converted into a church, was a declaration of war against the men who ran the counties and districts. Zheng Guofan, the Confucian scholar who had answered the emperor's call, was not just a general. He was the symbol of everything the Taiping had rejected. By 1855 and into 1856, the situation had begun to shift. Zheng Xiang army was growing in size and capability. The northern expedition was gone. The western expedition had stalled. The Taiping were still powerful, still in control of Tianjin and the Yangtze Valley, but they were no longer expanding. And inside the walls of the heavenly capital, in the palace where Hong Xiuquan had shut himself away from the world, something far more dangerous than any general was developing. The fault line was moving. Yang Shuqing had been speaking as God the Father since the early days of the movement. Each time he entered his trance and the voice of the Almighty issued from his throat, Hong had to submit. He had no choice. God outranked the heavenly king, and Yang's God spoke frequently and always in Yang's interest. By 1856, Yang was the most powerful man in the heavenly kingdom in everything but name. He had commanded the armies, administered the state, and now he was moving towards something more. Witnesses later said he had been preparing to claim the title of 10,000 years, the title of an emperor. Hong Xiuquan found out. In a city of spies and competing loyalties, in a palace from which he had not left in 3 years, the heavenly king prepared his response. What followed would be the moment the rebellion began to die, not from outside pressure, but from a decision made within those walls that the man who claimed to speak as God had to be silenced before he replaced the man who claimed to be God's son. By the summer of 1856, the Taiping heavenly kingdom was at a crossroads that its leaders could not see clearly. The Qing were struggling. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army had suffered its own setbacks. The dynasty's regular forces remained largely ineffective. The heavenly kingdom still held the Yangtze Valley, still governed tens of millions of people, and still fielded armies that no Qing general had yet found a way to definitively break. It was not winning, but it was not losing either. What it had was time, if its leaders used it wisely. They did not. The fault line that had been building inside the palace walls in Tianjin finally gave way in September 1856. It began with a demand. Yang Shuqing, the East King, the man who had built the Taiping army and administered the heavenly kingdom, while Hong Xiuquan retreated into religious seclusion, entered one of his trances. The voice of God the Father spoke through him, as it had many times before. This time, God demanded that the heavenly king elevate Yang's title from 9,000 years to 10,000 years, the title of an emperor. Hong had no authority to refuse God, but Hong did not refuse quietly. He summoned Wei Changwei, the North King, who was stationed in a distant province. His message was brief and unambiguous. Wei returned to Tianjin on the night of September 1 with 3,000 soldiers. At dawn the following morning, they surrounded Yang Shuqing's palace. Yang was inside with his family and his household. By the time the sun rose, Yang Shuqing, the man who had been the voice of God, the architect of every Taiping military strategy, the most capable administrator the kingdom had ever produced, was gone. Wei Changhui had been given a single name. He used the moment to settle every grievance that had accumulated during Yang's years of dominance. The killing did not stop with Yang. It spread through the streets of Tianjin for days, consuming Yang's followers, his associates, and anyone Wei considered a threat. More than 27,000 people were lost in the purge. Soldiers, officials, civilians, men who had marched from Guangxi with the movement in its earliest days. When Shidakai, the Wing King, the most universally respected military commander in the heavenly kingdom, returned to Tianjin and saw what Wei had done, he was horrified. His own family had been among those killed. He confronted Wei and barely escaped with his life. He fled the city and gathered forces, poised to march back. Hong, recognizing that one civil war had just ended and another was about to begin, had Wei Changwei executed. The man who had killed Yang was himself removed within weeks of the purge he had carried out. Hong then summoned Shi Dakai back to Tianjin and gave him command of the army. For a few months, it seemed as though the kingdom might recover. Shi restored order, rebuilt morale, and began to address the administrative collapse that Yang's death had created. The Taiping soldiers, who had lost their strategic commander, and then their military commander within the space of weeks, found in Shi something they could still believe in. But Hong Xiuquan watched Shi's popularity with the same suspicion he had directed at Yang. Within months, Hong had appointed his two brothers as kings, specifically to dilute Shi Dakai's authority. The message was unmistakable. The heavenly king trusted no one with genuine power. Shi Dakai, who had survived the purge and rebuilt the army, and now found himself systematically undermined by a man he had served faithfully since the beginning, understood what was happening. In 1857, he left Tianjin with his forces. He wrote a poem urging those who wished to follow him to do so freely. He would spend the remaining years of the rebellion fighting independently in the western provinces, never returning to the kingdom that had consumed everything around him. He was captured by the Qing in 1863 and did not survive their custody. The Tianjin incident, as it came to be known, did not just kill Yang Shuqing. It destroyed the Taiping leadership structure at the moment it was most needed. The East King had been irreplaceable, not because of his theology, but because of his competence. He had known how to move armies, how to administer provinces, how to make the practical decisions that Hong refused to make from behind his palace walls. The men who came after him were capable soldiers. None of them was a strategist of Yang's quality. Into this fractured kingdom, in 1856, came a second war on the outside. Britain, searching for a pretext to extract further trade concessions from the Qing, found one in October when Chinese officers seized a merchant vessel called the Arrow, registered in Hong Kong, on suspicion of smuggling. The incident was minor. The British response was not. The Second Opium War began with a British bombardment of Canton. France joined the alliance. Within 4 years, British and French forces had marched into Beijing itself, burned the emperor's summer palace to the ground, and extracted from a shattered king court a new round of humiliating treaties that opened 11 more ports and legalized the opium trade outright. The Qing were now fighting 2 wars simultaneously, the Taiping in the south, Britain and France in the north, with a treasury that had been drained by a decade of rebellion and an army that had never recovered from its first encounters with the god worshippers. That the dynasty survived at all was not the result of its own strength. It was the result of a calculation made in the treaty ports of Shanghai by men who had warehouses to protect. The Western powers, having extracted what they wanted from the Qing through force, had no desire to see that dynasty replaced by a Christian kingdom that had already made clear it would not honor the commercial treaties its predecessor had signed under duress. The Taiping had promised land reform, common ownership, the abolition of the trade networks that sustained foreign commerce. The Qing offered legal corruption, weak governance, and open ports. To the merchants of Shanghai, the choice was straightforward. Hong Xiuquan, sealed inside the heavenly capital, believed to the end that the Christian powers would come to his side. He had sent representatives to the treaty ports. He had written letters arguing that the Taiping were the natural allies of Britain and America. He received polite replies that promised nothing and delivered nothing. The missionaries who had visited Tianjin had gone home appalled. The merchants who ran Shanghai had already made their choice. By 1859, the Heavenly Kingdom was still standing but visibly weaker. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army, which had spent years rebuilding after its own reverses, was now advancing again from the west. A new protege of Zheng's, Li Hongzhang, a younger official from Anhui province, was forming a separate regional army in the east that would become a second arm of the same vice. The siege of Tianjin had not yet begun, but the armies that would conduct it were now in the field, growing stronger every season, led by men who would outlast every mistake the heavenly kingdom had made. Inside the palace, Hong Xiuquan had responded to the catastrophe of 1856 by retreating further into scripture. He issued proclamations in religious language that his remaining ministers struggled to interpret as practical instruction. He promoted relatives who lacked the ability of the men they replaced. He appointed kings by the score. The heavenly kingdom, at its end, had hundreds of kings, diluting every title until none of them meant anything. The man who had walked into Guangxi with nothing and built a state had become a prisoner of the walls he had never left. One figure arrived in 1859 who tried to reverse the decay. Hong Rengan, Hong Xiuquan's cousin, a man who had spent years in Hong Kong and absorbed Western ideas about governance, came to Tianjin and took charge of administration. He proposed railways, Western-style banks, a free press, a modern postal system. His proposals were intelligent and, had they been implemented a decade earlier, might have changed everything. They came too late. The Qing were closing in, the treasury was bare, and the heavenly king was no longer the man who had once set the world on fire with a pamphlet and a dream. Frederick Townsend Ward arrived in Shanghai in the spring of 1860 with almost nothing in his pockets and a biography that read like a fever dream. He had gone to sea at 15 after his application to West Point was rejected. He had sailed clipper ships to China, prospected for gold in California, fought with a filibuster army in Mexico, and served as an officer in the French army during the Crimean War, resigning after an insubordination charge. He was 28 years old. He had never held a steady job in his life. He had come to Shanghai to work in his father's shipping firm. He found something better to do almost immediately. The city he arrived in was in a state of controlled panic. The Taiping had been advancing on the Shanghai region, and the combination of foreign merchants, Qing officials, and treaty port residents who constituted the city's ruling class were facing a problem they could not solve with money alone. The Qing regular army had proved useless against the Taiping time and again. The Western powers had declared neutrality. What the city needed was a force that was capable, motivated, and technically not the army of any government. Ward was exactly that. A Shanghai banker and Qing official named Yang Feng agreed to fund him. Ward signed on as executive officer of an armed riverboat patrolling the approaches to the city and immediately distinguished himself in skirmishes against Taiping forces on the water. Yang Feng noticed. In the spring of 1860, as Taiping forces threatened to take Shanghai outright, Ward was given money, a mandate, and told to build an army. He began recruiting in the port's waterfront bars that same week. His first force was a collection of Western sailors, deserters, and adventurers, the kind of men who had washed up in Shanghai from every corner of the world and had no particular allegiance to anything except whoever was paying. They were trained in Western infantry tactics, equipped with Western weapons, and told they would be led by the man who had hired them. Ward's method of command was to go first. He walked at the front of every attack, wearing no distinguishing insignia that would mark him as the officer, refusing bodyguards, drawing fire alongside his men. They followed him because he had earned it. The British arrested him in 1860. They were maintaining official neutrality in the Chinese Civil War, and Ward's force of Western mercenaries, fighting for the Qing, crossed that line in ways they could not officially overlook. He was brought before a magistrate, charged, and released on his own recognizance. He promptly ignored the charges, slipped out of Shanghai, and rebuilt his force at his headquarters in Songjiang, a town southwest of the city. By the time the British had decided what to do about him, he had already won 2 more engagements. Back in Salem, Massachusetts, The newspapers reported almost nothing about what Ward was doing. In the spring of 1861, the same spring that shots were fired at Fort Sumter and the American Civil War began, Ward was being wounded in the face during an assault on Qingpu and evacuating to Paris for surgery. The two wars had now started running in parallel. While Grant and Lee prepared to destroy each other in Virginia, a man from Salem was recovering from a battlefield wound in a French hospital. Planning his return to China, Ward came back in 1861 and made the decision that transformed his force from a band of expensive Western guns for hire into something that actually worked. The European and American mercenaries he had recruited first were brave enough but unreliable. They drank, they deserted, they followed orders selectively. Ward replaced most of them and rebuilt around a core of Qing soldiers, trained by Western officers using Western methods. Commands were given in English, which the Chinese soldiers learned phonetically. He recruited a bodyguard of Filipino sailors from Manila, men he had met on the China coast trade runs, whose discipline and loyalty impressed him. The result was a genuinely hybrid force, unlike anything that had existed before. He also married Yang Fang's daughter, Yang Changmei, in 1862, cementing his relationship with his principal financier and making himself, in the most literal sense, part of the Chinese world he was fighting for. He renounced his American citizenship and became a subject of the Qing emperor. A man from Salem, Massachusetts, had gone Chinese, not as a performance, but as a commitment. He took a Chinese name. He flew a Chinese banner. The Qing court made him a mandarin of the third rank, an honor almost without precedent for a foreigner. In March 1862, the Qing government officially renamed his force. The ever-victorious army, Chang Sheng-jun in Chinese, was the name bestowed on a unit that had by that point won engagement after engagement against Taiping forces around the Shanghai Delta. The Taiping called Ward's men the Devil Soldiers. The name was not intended as a compliment. Ward's soldiers accepted it as one. He was wounded at least 14 times before the battle that killed him, injuries that would have ended most men's campaigns before they began. After each wound, he returned. The men who fought with him developed a conviction that he was unkillable, that something in the combination of his nerve and his luck placed him beyond ordinary risk. He had fought in over 70 engagements by the summer of 1862. The war was visibly turning in the Qing's favor. The Taiping were losing their hold on the cities around Shanghai. Zheng Guofan was closing from the west. The end of the rebellion, though not yet near, was taking shape. On September 20, 1862, Ward led a coordinated attack on the Taiping-held city of Qixi, a town commanding the river approaches to the agricultural region south of Shanghai. British, French, and Qing imperial forces all took part. Ward was at the front, as he always was. He was shot at the base of the city walls, a wound that went deep. He refused to leave the field until the attack had succeeded. When he finally collapsed, his soldiers carried him to a British gunboat anchored offshore. He spent his final 2 days on the gunboat, conscious and calm. He dictated his will. He arranged for money to go to his brother, his sister back in Massachusetts, and his Chinese wife. He had no particular last words recorded as heroic. He died in the early hours of September 22, 1862, 2 months before his 31st birthday. He had been in China for just over 2 years of active service. He was buried in Songshan in a tomb built for him by a grateful Qing government, an honor extended to no other foreigner in the dynasty's history. Back in Salem, there was a cenotaph, a memorial without a body because the body was in China. The newspapers printed his obituary. The American government, which had arrested him 2 years earlier for breaking neutrality, sent no formal condolences. His name was not added to any monument alongside the men who were dying in Virginia and Tennessee. The war he had fought, in which 30 million people would ultimately perish, was not America's war. He had simply gone there, chosen a side, and given everything he had. Ward's second in command was an American named Henry Bergevine, a North Carolinian charismatic and reckless, who almost immediately disgraced himself by attacking the Shanghai banker Yang Fang over a pay dispute and seizing 40,000 silver dollars by force. Li Hongzhang, who was now the principal Qing military commander in the East, dismissed Burgevine and turned to the British for a replacement. The man they sent was a Royal Engineers officer who had been in China since the Second Opium War, a devout and unusual man named Charles Gordon. He was 30 years old. He carried a small rattan cane. He did not believe in carrying weapons into battle. The ever-victorious army, built by an American from Salem who died 2 months before his 31st birthday, was about to become famous, and the man who made it famous was not the man who built it. That is the history Ward received. He built the thing, and someone else got the credit. The cenotaph in Salem is the only monument to him in the country he came from. On the other side of the world, inside the walls of the heavenly capital, Hong Xiuquan had no clear picture of what was happening. His armies were still fighting. The kingdom was still standing. He was still issuing proclamations in the name of God the Father and Jesus Christ, still certain that the Christian powers of the West would eventually see the justice of his cause. He did not yet know about the man with the rattan cane, who was now organizing the army that would finish what Frederick Townsend Ward had started. Charles Gordon arrived in China in 1860 as a Royal Engineers officer assigned to strengthen the defenses of Shanghai's European quarter during the Second Opium War. He spent 2 years on garrison duty, watched British and French forces march into Beijing and burn the emperor's summer palace, and found himself in a country he was simultaneously fighting and coming to understand. When the war ended, he stayed. By the time Li Hongzhang offered him command of the ever-victorious army in March 1863, Gordon was 30 years old and had already seen more of China than most British officers would see in a career. He was an unusual man in every sense that the Victorian era produced. Deeply Christian, not performatively, but in the way that governed every decision, he carried a small rattan cane into battle and refused to carry weapons of any kind. He believed that his life was in God's hands and that carrying a pistol implied otherwise. His soldiers found this either inspiring or inexplicable, and often both. The Chinese officers who worked alongside him told each other that he had special powers. Li Hongzhang, who was not a sentimental man, described Gordon in a dispatch to Beijing as a direct blessing from heaven. He took command of a force that had spent several months under Henry Burgevine, descending into indiscipline and financial chaos. Gordon imposed order immediately and without negotiation. He docked pay for looting. He dismissed officers who could not control their men. He made clear that he would lead from the front, as Ward had done, but that the force would fight as a disciplined army rather than as a collection of armed individuals pursuing private advantage. Within weeks, the ever-victorious army was operational again. Within months, it was winning. His tactical innovation was the waterways. The Yangtze Delta was laced with canals and rivers, a network that the Taiping had used to move troops and supplies for a decade. Gordon requisitioned armed steamers, moved his artillery by water, and struck at towns from directions the Taiping did not anticipate. In May 1863, he used an armored paddle steamer called the Hyson to punch through Taiping River defenses and take the city of Kunshan before its garrison had organized a proper response. The local peasants who had suffered under Taiping occupation attacked the retreating forces from behind. Gordon was already a figure of legend in the villages around Shanghai. He fought through the summer and into the autumn of 1863, taking town after town. He won 33 consecutive engagements. The rattan cane became famous, the wand of victory, his men called it. What the cane actually represented to Gordon was a point of theology. The outcome of a battle was in God's hands, not his. He walked into musket fire, holding a stick, because he genuinely believed that God would not let him fall before his work was done. He was right until the day the heavenly capital fell. After that, there was no more work in China for him to do. In November 1863, the ever-victorious army and Li Hongzhang's Huai forces laid siege to Suzhou, a city of enormous strategic importance, the wealthiest city in the Yangtze Delta and the principal Taiping stronghold east of Tianjin. The city's garrison was exhausted, short on food and ammunition, and its commanders could see which way the war was going. Gordon negotiated directly with the Taiping princes inside the walls. He gave them his personal guarantee. Surrender the city and their lives would be spared. They trusted him. The gates were opened on December 6. Gordon was not present at the surrender ceremony. When he arrived the following morning and asked where the Taiping princes were, he was told they had been taken to Li Hongzhang's headquarters. They had been executed the previous evening, all of them, within hours of opening the gates on Gordon's personal guarantee. Gordon learned this fact standing in the city he had just taken. He armed himself. He spent the rest of the day searching for Li Hongzhang with the intention of holding him to account personally. Li did not come out to face him. Gordon resigned. He submitted his resignation to Li Hongzhang and refused further orders. Li sent messengers, he sent gifts, he sent money. Gordon refused everything and remained at his headquarters at Kunshan, inactive for 2 months. The British authorities in Shanghai were alarmed. Without Gordon, the ever-victorious army was leaderless, and the final campaign against the Taiping stalled. Li Hongzhang eventually agreed to issue a public statement accepting full responsibility for the executions at Suzhou. Gordon returned to command in February 1864. The emperor, grateful beyond the capacity of the imperial gift-giving system to express, sent Gordon rewards. He sent gold in bowls, carried by the emperor's own messengers. Gordon sent the gold back and dismissed the messengers with contempt, making clear he could not be bought. He accepted the imperial yellow jacket, the highest military honor in the Qing army, because it was an honor, not a payment. He accepted the rank of T2, the highest grade in the Chinese military hierarchy. He refused everything that could be measured in money. By the spring of 1864, the end of the Heavenly Kingdom was no longer a question of whether, but of when. Zheng Guofan had closed the siege of Tianjin from the west. Gordon's forces and Li Hongzhang's Huai army had cleared the eastern approaches. The Taiping held the capital and a shrinking ring of territory around it. Gordon was ordered not to participate in the final assault on Tianjin. The Qing government wanted the honor of retaking its capital to belong entirely to Chinese forces. Gordon accepted this and disbanded his army. The ever-victorious army was dissolved in May 1864. Inside the walls of the heavenly capital, Hong Xiuquan had been issuing proclamations throughout the siege. He refused all requests to evacuate. He declared that God would defend the city. The city was starving. The population had swelled with Taiping soldiers and refugees, and the siege had cut the food supply completely. Hong began eating weeds pulled from the palace gardens and urged his followers to do the same, telling them that if they believed, the weeds would sustain them. His generals begged him to leave. He told them that any follower who abandoned Tianjin was an apostate and would be condemned. On June 4, 1864, Hong Xiuquan died. The exact cause, whether illness from the contaminated food he was eating or something else, was never established with certainty. He had been the heavenly king for 13 years, 3 months and 21 days. He was 50 years old. He had never left the city he had entered in triumph in 1853. He installed his 15-year-old son on the throne before he died. The boy's reign lasted 6 weeks. On July 19, Zheng Guofan ordered his engineers to detonate explosives packed into tunnels that had been dug beneath the eastern walls. A 60-yard section of wall collapsed. The Xiang army poured through the gap. The fighting in the streets lasted 3 days. When it was over, Zheng Guofan reported to Beijing that nearly 100,000 Taiping soldiers and followers had fallen rather than surrender to the Qing. A final act of collective defiance he found remarkable enough to record explicitly. He found this remarkable enough to record it explicitly in his dispatch to the emperor. An army that had begun with 20,000 followers gathered on a hilltop in Guangxi had fought for 13 years and refused, at its end, to yield. Hong Xiuquan's body was exhumed from the palace gardens where his followers had buried him. Qing officials needed proof that he was actually dead. The body was identified and cremated. His ashes were scattered by cannon fire, so that the man who had claimed to be the Son of God would have no grave and no resting place. His young son, captured in November 1864, did not survive Qing custody. The heavenly kingdom of great peace had lasted 13 years and 2 months. It had consumed, by the most conservative estimates, 20 million lives. Gordon left China in January 1865. He returned to England, where an enthusiastic public had already given him a name he would carry for the rest of his life: Chinese Gordon. He spent the next 20 years in various imperial postings, the Sudan, Egypt, accumulating a legend that the Victorian press was happy to manufacture and the public happy to consume. In January 1885, he was killed at Khartoum, besieged by Mahdist forces in the Sudan, becoming one of the most celebrated British deaths of the 19th century. The ever-victorious army had been built by an American from Salem who no one remembered. The fame went to the Englishman who finished the job. The rebellion was over. The Qing dynasty had survived, but the men who had saved it, Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and the regional commanders who had built private armies to fight a war the imperial forces could not win, were still standing, and the armies they commanded were still under their control. The dynasty had traded its survival for something it could not yet see the cost of. The Qing dynasty had survived. That was the official verdict of 1864, and it was technically accurate. The emperor still sat on the dragon throne in Beijing. The imperial examination system would be restored. The Confucian order that the Taiping had tried to burn to the ground would be rebuilt on the ruins of the Yangtze Valley. From Beijing, the dynasty declared victory and set about the work of recovery. What it could not see, what no one looking at China in 1864 could fully see, was that the survival had come at a price that would take 50 years to collect. The cost in lives alone was almost beyond comprehension. Between 20 and 30 million people had died over 14 years. From the fighting itself, from the famines that followed armies moving through farmland, from the diseases that spread through refugee camps swollen with the displaced. Some estimates place the figure higher. Jiangsu province, one of the wealthiest and most densely populated regions in China, may have lost half its population. The lower Yangtze Valley, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of most of its tax revenue, the foundation of its commercial economy, was a wasteland. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were empty. Irrigation systems had collapsed. Farmland had reverted to scrub. In the city of Anqing, 60 years after the rebellion ended, the ruins left by the fighting were still visible along the waterfront. A travel brochure from the 1930s noted the damage and pointed tourists toward it as a historical site. The recovery had been real but incomplete. The landscape of central China bore the marks of the rebellion for generations, not as monuments but as absences. Fields that no longer produced what they once had, towns that never regained the populations they lost, families whose genealogical lines simply stopped in the years between 1851 and 1864. The political cost was less visible in 1864, and more important in the long run. The Qing dynasty had saved itself by doing the one thing that dynastic theory said a stable empire must never do. It had handed military power to regional commanders who were loyal to themselves. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army, Li Hongzhang's Huai army, the armies of Zuo Zongtang. These forces had won the war. They were not disbanded after winning it. The men who commanded them had spent over a decade building networks of personal loyalty, regional financing, and independent procurement. The emperor rewarded them with titles and honors. He did not take their armies away. Zheng Guofan understood what he had become, and it made him uneasy. After the fall of Tianjin, He quietly disbanded much of the Xiang army himself, aware, in the way that thoughtful men sometimes see clearly what governments prefer not to, that an empire built on regional strongmen was an empire with an expiration date. But the pattern was set. Other commanders did not disband. Li Hongzhang retained his Hui army and went on to become the most powerful official in China for the next 3 decades. The precedent of the regional strongman, the military commander, who governed his province as a personal fief, was now embedded in the Qing system as firmly as any formal institution. The self-strengthening movement that emerged in the 1860s and 1870s was the dynasty's attempt to learn from what had nearly destroyed it. Li Hongzhang and others argued that China needed Western technology, modern arsenals, a navy built on Western models, factories, railways. Li himself oversaw the construction of the Jiangnan arsenal in Shanghai and the modernization of the Northern Fleet. The movement produced real infrastructure. It did not produce the institutional reform that would have given that infrastructure a stable foundation to rest on. The Qing court accepted new weapons but resisted the changes in governance and accountability that would have made those weapons meaningful. The dynasty stumbled on. The Boxer Uprising of 1900 brought Western armies to Beijing again. The emperor fled, more concessions were signed, more indemnities were paid. More territory was effectively surrendered to foreign control. Each humiliation deepened the question that the Taiping had first made impossible to ignore. Could the Qing actually govern China? By 1900, a growing number of educated Chinese had concluded that the answer was no, and that the problem was not merely the Manchu dynasty but the entire imperial system. Sun Yat-sen, who would lead the revolution that toppled the dynasty in 1911, called Hong Xiuquan a patriotic hero. He referred to himself as Hong Xiuquan II. The connection was not merely rhetorical. Sun came from Guangdong, the same province as Hong. He too had encountered Christianity at a formative moment. He too had concluded that the Qing had forfeited any legitimate claim to govern China. The Taiping Rebellion had planted a question in the soils of Chinese political thought that the 1911 revolution finally answered. Imperial rule was not eternal. It had ended once in everything but name. It could end again. In October 1911, a local revolutionary group in the city of Wuhan launched an uprising that, through a combination of luck and the dynasty's terminal exhaustion, sparked provincial secessions across the country. The last Qing emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated in February 1912. 2,000 years of continuous imperial rule ended with a child's signature on an abdication decree. The crack in the foundation that the Taiping had opened in 1851 had finally, after 60 years, broken through. The Republic of China that replaced the Qing was almost immediately in trouble. Sun Yat-sen, who had been elected provisional president, handed power to Yuan Shikai, a former Qing military commander, a man whose authority rested on the same regional army structure that Zheng Guofan had pioneered. Yuan ruled as a near dictator and briefly declared himself emperor before dying in 1916. After his death, the thing that the Taiping Rebellion had made structurally inevitable finally arrived in full, the warlord era. From 1916 to 1928, China fragmented under the authority of regional military commanders, warlords in all but the diplomatic language used to describe them, each controlling territory with private armies, each collecting taxes and governing populations by personal force. The pattern had been running since the 1850s, when the Qing had decided that a Confucian scholar building a private army in Hunan was preferable to letting the Taiping win. That decision had been correct and necessary. Its consequences had merely been deferred. The revolution that finally ended the warlord era and unified China under a single government was led by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. Mao did not come to the Taiping Rebellion as a neutral historian. He admired Hong Xiuquan explicitly, praised him in 1949 at the ceremony inaugurating the People's Republic as an early revolutionary leader, ordered monuments and museums built in his honor, and had the Jintian Uprising, the first battle of the Taiping Rebellion, commemorated on the monument erected in Tiananmen Square. The land reform, the common ownership, the uprising of the rural poor against a corrupt ruling class. These were not details Mao found incidental. They were the Taiping's clearest claim to having started something that he believed he had finished. And yet the man who had actually crushed the Taiping, Zheng Guofen, the Confucian scholar who built the Shang army and breached the walls of Tianjin, was Mao's childhood hero. Mao grew up in Hunan, the same province as Zheng. He studied Zheng's writings on military organization, on discipline, on the relationship between an army and the population it moves through. The military doctrine that Mao used to build the People's Liberation Army drew directly from the methods Zheng had pioneered. The rebellion's legacy ran in two directions at once: the ideology of the Taiping in one hand, the military methods of the man who destroyed them in the other. The question of what the Taiping Rebellion actually was has never fully settled. A peasant uprising, a millenarian cult, a proto-socialist state, a religious movement that happened to generate the most destructive civil war in the history of the 19th century. The Chinese Communist Party has called it all of these things at different moments, depending on what the political moment required. What it cannot be called, in any honest accounting, is a footnote. The war that killed between 20 and 30 million people and stretched across 17 provinces over 14 years reshaped the country that fought it so thoroughly that every subsequent major event in Chinese history, the 1911 revolution, the warlord era, the communist victory of 1949, is incomprehensible without it. The man who set it in motion read a pamphlet on a bookshelf. He had been given the pamphlet 9 years earlier by a stranger outside an examination hall. He had not looked at it carefully until the fourth time he failed the exam. He was 30 years old. He had nothing. And in the particular way that history sometimes works, not through the plans of through the powerful men, but through the private convictions of people that power has discarded. Everything that followed came from that moment, a failed clerk alone with a book in a country that was already burning, deciding that he finally understood what God wanted him to do. Frederick Townsend Ward is buried somewhere in China, in a grave his own government never acknowledged and that no one has been able to locate for generations. The Qing dynasty that his army helped save was gone within 50 years. The heavenly kingdom that he fought against is remembered today as a monument in Tiananmen Square and a museum in Guangdong. The world he walked into when he arrived in Shanghai in 1860, the world of imperial China, of the mandate of heaven, of dynasties that had lasted 3,000 years, was already ending. He had simply been the most improbable character in the final act of a story that had been building for decades. A man from Salem, Massachusetts, in the middle of the deadliest civil war in human history, fighting for a dynasty he had adopted as his own, killed at 30 by a musket ball outside a city wall he had never heard of the year before, 2 months before his 31st birthday, 2 months after the American Civil War had started back home. He has a cenotaph in Salem. The inscription gives his name and the dates. It does not mention that he helped save an empire. It does not mention the 30 million dead. It does not mention that the army he built and the man who came after him and the dynasty they served together are all gone now. And that China, the country he gave everything to defend, eventually built a monument to the man who started the war instead.